Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. We are so excited to be closing out our Black History Month series. And I'll introduce myself. I'm Iris Reddick-Manberg. I am a second-year PhD student. I'm one of the 3 committee members who helped to put this together. It's myself, along with Matt Vega, who's here, a PhD candidate, and Dean Lumpkin. So we started, thank you. We started the series with Professor R.L. Watson, who is an alum here, and she spoke on the arc of Dr. Martin Luther King back in January. We continued with a book event where we gave out a number of free books, speaking to various topics in Black theology and history. Then we went on to welcome Professor Ebony Marshall-Turman, who is a professor at Yale Divinity School. We've heard from Professor Larisha Hawkins from the University of Virginia. We've heard from Professor Reverend Dr. Braxton Shelley from Yale Divinity School as well. Reverend Dr. Niall Fort from Columbia University. And today we have the distinct honor of welcoming Professor Jeremy Williams. So a bit about him before he comes. Reverend Jeremy L. Williams is a native of Huntsville, Alabama. He's an assistant professor of New Testament at Bright Divinity School. His PhD dissertation at Harvard University engaged racialization and criminalization in Acts of the Apostles. He has a number of publications, and his most recent is entitled, I Am a Human, Racializing Assemblages and Criminalized Egyptianese in Acts 21, 31 through 39, Embitter the Chastening Rod. His book, Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, Race, Rhetoric, and the Prosecution of an Early Christian Movement, is under contract with Cambridge University Press and is scheduled to be published in 2023. He has done archaeological restoration at Magdala, Israel, and he has presented work in Germany at the Berlin Graduate School of Ancient Studies. He graduated with highest honors in religious studies and economics from Vanderbilt University. He earned the MDiv from Yale Divinity School and received the Henry Hallam Tweedy Award, which is the highest award given to graduating students. Reverend Williams is ordained as an elder in full connection in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. He has led in ministry for almost 20 years and has led as a pastor of 3 congregations. 5 months ago, he and his spouse, Kiera, welcomed their first child, baby Jay, into the world. Yes. Why don't you all join me in welcoming Professor Reverend Dr. Jeremy Williams.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to the committee, to Iris Reddick-Manberg, thank you so much, and Matt Vegas, and to Dean Lumpkin in her absence, to those who'll be watching, and to my brother and best friend who joined us, Nate Marshall, who's here, and to all of you who are here on this just really powerful day. And after that great lineup, and you're still here to engage in more intellectual stimulation around Black history, I appreciate it. Those speakers you've had before are awesome, and so I feel honored to be a part of this series of lectures. And so from the topic for today, as you could have seen in the email communications and otherwise, I'll be talking about this verse, this passage from Acts 16. It's called Free Those People is the name of this talk, which is a direct quotation from Acts 16:35, with the subtitle as Exploring Critical Race Theory for Analyzing Liberative Myths, Criminalized Movements, and Acts of the Apostles. Now, it may seem strange and somewhat even dangerous to consider critical race theory or CRT in conversation with texts from the ancient Mediterranean. It can seem dangerous as state legislatures, especially like the one in Texas, the state where I currently reside, have banned teaching CRT. Ron DeSantis' Florida has leveled a fascist attack against an undefinable wokeism that somehow includes African American AP history. Such attacks show the danger and urgency of intellectual work that interweaves CRT and a text like the Bible that occupies a central role in Western identity formation and authority construction. CRT's critique on racialization that is ingrained in the legal fabric of the United States provides tools for analyzing both contemporary and ancient times, which I hope to demonstrate through a reading of Acts 16 through 40. So please hear my translation of those verses. And it was as we were going to the place of prayer, a certain enslaved girl who had a Pythian spirit met us. She supplied her masters much productive labor through the work of her divination. Trailing behind Paul and us, she cried out saying, "These people are slaves of the highest God. These proclaim to you a movement of salvation." She did this for many days. Paul was grieved, and he turned to the Spirit and said, "I summon you in the name of Messiah Jesus to come out of her." And he came out of her that hour. When her masters saw that their hope of labor came to an end, they took hold of Paul and Silas and dragged them into the market square to the authorities. And when they brought them forward, the sheriffs, they said, "These people are stirring up our city. They are Jews, and they proclaim customs which are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or do." The crowd joined in attacking them, and the sheriffs commanded them to be beaten after stripping their clothes. After roughing them up, they threw them into jail and commanded the prison guard to hold them securely. Per instruction, he threw them into the innermost jail and secured their feet in wooden stocks. At midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and celebrating God, and the imprisoned ones were listening to them. Suddenly, there was a great shaking, to the point that the foundation of the prison shook, and all the gates were opened on the spot, and the imprisonment of all was loosened. The prison guard became woke, and seeing the doors of the jail open, drew the sword and prepared to use it on himself, because he thought that the prisoners had run away. Then Paul shouted with a great voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." Asking for a light, he busted in trembling and fell before Paul and Silas. Now to verse 35. The next day, the sheriff sent the armed deputies, saying, "Free those people." I'll stop here for now. CRT brings a new level of insight to the words of those whom I translate as sheriffs in this passage when they say "free those people." Later, I'll explain in detail why I translate strategoi as sheriffs. But here it's important to see how a lens attuned to CRT's critique of the law and its representatives can even impact translational practices, which are already acts of interpretation. My use of CRT, which I'll deepen with myth criticism and womanist cultural criticism, will demonstrate the fruitfulness of examining how the Pythian spirit in the enslaved girl and the prison that shakes in Acts 16, 25 through 40 would have recalled to a 2nd century CE audience myths about gods, divine noises occurring behind us, like in the prison in Philippi. And so, my use of CRT, it'll demonstrate the fruitfulness of examining how the Pythian spirit in the enslaved girl and the prison that shakes in Acts 16, 25 through 40 would have recalled to a 2nd century CE audience myths about gods, especially the gods Apollo and Dionysus. And we will explore how those myths were used judicially or extrajudicially to criminalize and activate judicial processes. Also, we'll explore how those myths also offer strategies for liberation. Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik identify 4 hallmarks of critical race theory: structural determinism, interest convergence, a critique of liberalism, and the hallmark that I will focus on for our talk today, revisionist history. CRT's hallmark of revisionist history operates to tell the stories that are often eclipsed by dominant narratives. The concept of revisionist history in CRT presumes that triumphal narratives that articulate progress often fail to tell the stories of the people who died or involuntarily sacrificed to make the narrative possible. This is not the same project of a revisionist history that certain communities, especially those in power, use to paint more flattering versions of themselves and their putative ancestors' past. CRT's revisionist history instead tells the story from the underside and tends to the carnage that triumphalist narratives ignore. The term revisionist history in CRT more closely resembles what Dipesh Chakrabarty in Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference would describe as subaltern narratives. In this way, revisionist history in CRT functions like history too in post-colonial theory, which takes seriously the stories told by subalterns and seeks to hear their voices in spite of the overcompensating, deafening, triumphal narratives of the hegemony. Hence, feminists and womanists have rightly leaned into the hermeneutic of suspicion that refuses to accept narratives at face value, especially those that further denigrate women and marginalize minoritized people. To capture a fuller perspective of history, one must incorporate the voices of the people who have been colonized, subjected, and rendered minoritized. Dominant narratives, told through various types of media, from literature to drama, often mythologize subaltern minoritized people as simple, backward, lewd, and unlawful in order to garner sympathy for their oppressors. Such narratives are cultural productions that tell only a portion of the story from a privileged position and often legitimize the destruction, exploitation, and dehumanization of subjected people in order to forward a narrative about the dominant culture. Ancient authors frequently deployed myths or stories, mythoi, to communicate information about the myths themselves and about the people affiliated with the gods, whether Jewish, Greek, or Egyptian, in stories. John Weaver takes up this issue in his analysis of Acts and applies what he terms a myth-critical approach. A myth-critical approach focuses on the diverse choices that different authors make when they deploy the same myths and motifs as each other, but to different ends. Weaver's approach moves beyond questions of dependency to focus on the diverse choices different authors make when they deploy themes and motifs. My application of Weaver's method uses myth and story interchangeably, understanding that mythos can simply mean a story or a narrative. Although, like Weaver, I focus on stories about gods, I'm less interested in what the myths tell us about the gods and more interested in how mythoi can be used to classify people. Stories about gods and legal systems were tied up in antiquity, as they are now. Weaver's attention to how different authors deploy myths leads him to explore Acts' deployment of the Dionysus myth in service of the Messiah movement. A broader question that can be drawn from his work is, how are myths used to serve or refute dominant narratives? What stories are being told and or resisted to legitimate the socio-political processes, the authority of those in power, and the subjugation of those without? Note, I referred to the group of Jesus followers in Acts as the Messiah movement. This is connected to my translation of He Hodos, which is Acts' favorite way of describing the early Jesus followers. The phrase can mean the way, the road, the journey, or the term I prefer, the movement. I prefer this as a way to capture Acts' dominant theme of movement and to draw attention to how movements are often deemed suspicious by those in power. Thinking about the Jesus followers and the followers of Dionysus as a movement helps to show the blurry boundary between the religious and political. The difficulty of distinguishing between the secular and the religious was certainly not resolved in the first century CE, if it ever was. This difficulty demonstrates the religious or God-oriented basis of authority for Roman law, its officials, and its jurists, which provide a backdrop for acts. Connecting gods, courts, and imperial officials was a ubiquitous practice in the Roman Empire. Matthew Larson and Mark Letney, when discussing the Roman prison at Lambaesis, cite Henrik Nissen, who states that it is worth remembering the parallel connection between the state prison and the high temples of Rome. The carcer and the executioner's block were closely connected to one another, not only for the purposes of convenience, but because penal law is a religious act, because the blood of the guilty is offered to gods as an expiatory sacrifice. End quote. The gods authorized the activity of Roman courts, and those who sat in positions of authority, like governors, were granted divine sanction for their activities. The emperor himself, often worshipped as a god, wielded the authority to judge and deem anyone a criminal, regardless of their status. The crime of offending the emperor was eventually linked to the Lex Julia on treason, or maiestas, which was one of the crimes listed in Justinian's Digest, a 6th century compilation of earlier Roman laws. Treason, or Lex Julia, was a political, judicial, and religious crime. Traces of this can be found in Luke Acts, and how the Jerusalem leaders accused Jesus of opposing paying taxes to the emperor and claiming to be a king. A similar charge is raised against Paul and the Messiah movement in Acts 17:7, where they are charged with asserting that Jesus was king and the emperor was not. Offering a different myth or story to the empires was a chargeable offense. For Luke Acts, such charges, if true, merited a decisive response from Roman officials who represented Caesar's empire. Stories and myths were and are political. Weaver's approach, CRT's revisionist history, and the connections between storytelling and legal policy can be deepened even further by tending to how womanist Emily Towns engages the role that stories and imagination play in classifying humans. Towns critiques destructive dominant narratives by exposing whom they intentionally ignore or cast in disparaging light. She centers her discussion on the marginalization of Black women and how they are transmogrified into welfare queens and dominating matriarchs in public discourse. This analysis is the basis for her understanding of the cultural production of evil, which is governed by what she calls the fantastic hegemonic imagination. She pairs Antonio Gramsci's hegemony, which is a controlling structure that normalizes domination, with Michel Foucault's notion of the fantastic taken from Fantasia in the Library, which discusses how fantasies about people and bodies move beyond books and libraries to impact people's actual experiences. She states, the fantastic hegemonic imagination traffics in people's lives that are caricatured or pillaged so that the imagination that creates the fantastic can control the world in its own image. She describes the fantastic hegemonic imagination as the interiority of evil that pillages and characterizes stories about the marginalized in order to establish its own legitimacy and power. The fantastic hegemonic imagination is the cultural production of evil through dominant narratives that function to dehumanize marginalized groups, especially Black women. Towns describes the project of understanding the fantastic hegemonic imagination this way. Exploring evil as a cultural production highlights the systematic construction of truncated narratives designed to support and perpetuate structural inequities and forms of social oppression. Thus, the interdisciplinary study of dismantling evil as a cultural production seeks to understand the interior material life of these narratives, end quote. As untrue narratives are parroted throughout a society, these myths about individuals and groups remind those people of their status and position in society, and these myths work to reify those positions. Towns argues that the fantastic hegemonic imagination plays with history and memory to spawn caricatures and stereotypes. Towns' analysis is contemporary, concerned with how the casting of black women in relation to narratives of the Aunt Jemima or the Sapphire produces what she calls the fine rain of death that excludes such women from equal access to justice, health care, and other resources. Her approach complements the notion of intersectionality, a term coined by U.S. legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, to capture how multiple forms of marginalization and exclusion often work to exacerbate each other. Crenshaw also uses the experience of black women to discuss how intersectionality addresses their marginalization as not just the sum of their various exclusions, racism and sexism, but how those oppressions compound. Her analysis extends beyond race and sex to include class, citizenship status, and other types of minoritization. And it's also worth introducing here Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism to complement the discussion. Gilmore defines racism as state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Let me say that again. Gilmore defines racism as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Gilmore further writes that racism is the ordinary means through which dehumanization achieves ideological normality, while at the same time, the practice of dehumanizing people produces racial categories. This culture, in turn, is based on the modern secular state's dependence on classification, combined with militarism, as a means through which classification maintains its coherence. Towns, Crenshaw's, and Gilmore's contemporary analyses provide lenses for antiquity. Through them, we become attentive to how the criminalized were produced in antiquity through narratives, including those instantiated in plays, statuary, and literature. I refer to this production as the Roman hegemonic imagination. Towns' framework interrogates who benefits from stories and myths that criminalize. Her framework also highlights how people's narratives are excised or narrated negatively in order to prop up dominant narratives and their imaginations. The Roman hegemonic imagination provides a bridge from those more contemporary theories to ancient texts like Luke Acts. And I'll use it now to examine how Acts 16 uses myths of Apollo to disparage the enslaved girl and truncate her narrative. Then I will turn to how Acts alludes to myths of Dionysus to present the Messiah movement as criminalized by officials who are inept local and imperial leaders. This demonstration I hope to present will show the multidirectionality of myths and the importance of assessing their uses critically when they are used to legitimate authority, especially when that authority is used to dehumanize and criminalize others. Although Luke Acts often presents concern for remedying issues around gender and wealth inequality, the texts are still very much situated in the values, myths, and stories of the Roman hegemonic imagination. Jeffrey Staley highlights features in Acts 16 that demonstrate how this passage participates in a Roman hegemonic imagination. First, Staley notes how Roman imperial figures like Julius Caesar and Claudius are portrayed by Suetonius as having dreams that provided instructions for their military campaigns. Although Paul is not a military leader, his dream calling him to Macedonia likely evokes the narrative topos of imperial figures who receive divine sanction to enter and dominate new territories and people. Second, individuals and groups who perceive themselves as having divine authority to enter and control a new region are tested and confirmed through the performing of an exorcism. In Acts 16, the enslaved girl with the Pythian spirit is not offered agency by Paul, but her body becomes a site used for a power contest. Acts' Pythian-inspired enslaved girl could be linked to the Delphic oracle, and even if she is not, by suggesting that she had a Pythian spirit, Acts associates her with the type of bodily, mantic, oracular activity that would have been well known in antiquity. Certainly, even Plutarch, priest at Delphi, discussed the Pythia and directs invective against her. The Pythian prophetess's body was already a site for divine Apollonian power. Linking the enslaved girl's Pythian spirit to Apollo allows us to see the relevance of both myth criticism and an analysis of the Roman hegemonic imagination in this passage. Her activity is linked with a God that is opposed to Paul's God, and Acts portrays Paul as moving through colonized territory like an emperor. From Acts' perspective, the enslaved girl's Pythian spirit attempts to undermine the Messiah movement's message, and Paul responds forcibly. Musa Duba Shimona highlights how it is common for biblical texts to link soon-to-be-conquered territory with quote-unquote bad women, and how heroic men receive divine sanction to overpower these women. Staley applies Shimona's formula for analyzing the type scenes in which new territory and bad women converge to Acts 16. Her analysis involves a traveling hero journeys to a foreign land, meets a woman, and binds with her. Through these features in Acts 16, Staley helps to illustrate how Acts wields Roman logics of conquest and expansion to portray this girl as a foil for expanding the work of the Messiah movement into different regions. And although Acts shows the enslaved girl through a lens of Apollonian illegitimacy, womanist and feminist thinkers invite interpreters to read against the grain to identify the enslaved girl with a Pythian spirit as a sassy truth teller who provides a glimpse into the lives of those who, like her, were on the underside of Roman hegemonic imaginations, those that attempted to belittle her voice. The enslaved girl states that Paul and the Messiah movement are slaves of the highest God, which is the truth. In her essay, This Little Light of Mine, womanist biblical scholar Mitzi Smith elevates the enslaved girl with the Pythian spirit and presents her as a role model. She states, like the Pythian slave girl with her truth-telling oracles, the womanist biblical scholar must engage in prophetic truth-telling at the risk of annoying the power brokers, at the risk of being demonized. In other work, Smith discusses how this truth-telling gets perceived as sass. She describes sass in this way: for black women, talkback and/or sass has been and remains in some situations the only means of agency, of being heard, and of combating an other-imposed invisibility. It is resistance language that children, women, people of color, and black women in particular speak and embody inside and outside black communities and institutions. Sass is often defined as mouthing off, talking back, back-talking, attitude, a woman not backing down to a man, or a child determined to have the final word in response to a real or perceived injustice or wrong. Sass is rooted for Smith in black women's experiences, in which they are frequently chastised for speaking up for themselves and seen as aggressive for requesting basic treatment as humans. Sass is speaking the whole story and telling the truth. Now I'll turn to the connection between Acts 16 through 40, and the myth and stories of another sassy figure, Dionysus. At the beginning of this talk, I suggested that both the story of the Pythian spirit and the enslaved girl and the prison that shakes in Acts 16:25 through 40 recall to a second century audience myths about gods. This part of the talk will examine how the prison shaking, the narratives exemplified in Euripides' Bacchae, and the Bacchic movement more broadly provide a contextual companion for analyzing how the criminalization of the Messiah movement in Acts 16:25 through 40 could have been interpreted by Acts' earliest interpreters. Euripides' tale of Dionysus includes his introduction to Thebes, his standoff with King Pentheus, and the miraculous escapes from prison by Dionysus and his followers. Several scholars have noted the connections between Acts and Bacchae. Fiacre Macgorin puts it in these terms. Luke's narrative activates Euripides' play as a telling intertext and speaks to the capacity of Dionysus and Bacchae more specifically to address Roman anxieties about mystery religions, as well as to address Christian anxieties about Roman political geography, end quote. Most scholars who agree that Acts narrative activates Euripides' play analyze the connections between Bacchae and Acts 16 by focusing on the earthquake and the miraculous jail doors opening. Some even focus on the epiphanic moment prior to the prison guard's conversion. Some scholars have emphasized Dionysian mythology's focus on liberation, salvation, and orthopraxis and worship. However, scholars have not underscored how the followers of Dionysus are arrested on false charges and imprisoned at the whim of a corrupt, simple-minded governmental official. We don't know any of those, do we? Scholarship has not yet attended to how criminalization and Dionysus mythology or theology provides a backdrop for criminalizing the Messiah movement. Studying Acts 16 along with Dionysus and the Bacchae allows an analysis of three aspects of criminalization of movements. One, criminalization as a rhetorical project that involves mythologizing. Two, propaganda or cultural productions that render some people's bodies as vulnerable. And three, depictions of criminalized characters who talk back to unjust systems. Through analyzing the criminalization of Dionysus and his followers in Bacchae, I expose that the intertextuality of Acts with stories of Dionysus is not merely an aesthetic echo, but also relates to power and justice. Acts' Roman hegemonic imagination does not prevent the text from using Dionysian theology or mythology to critique Roman officials' behavior. The god of wine, ritual madness, theater, and a happy afterlife was rarely a neutral figure in Greek theology or in the Roman political imagination. People across the Roman Empire would have become familiar with Dionysus through ongoing worship as well as through education and entertainment. Although some Roman elites venerated Dionysus, others portrayed people associated with Dionysus as criminalized or subjugated. Tacitus dismisses Bacchants, who are the followers of Dionysus, in Annals 1131. His historical narrative introduces Messalina, the third wife of Emperor Claudius, who married Senator Silius when Claudius went out of town. Tacitus perceives her marriage to Silius as illicit, and he attributes this unseemly behavior to her participation in Bacchant rituals as a monad or a Dionysus worshiper. In Livy's 1st century BC History of Rome, Book 39, he presents the Bacchanalia affair. He portrays the Bacchants as an infectious disease spreading across Rome, a disease that must be rooted out by the government officials arresting, imprisoning, and even executing its members. The audience of Acts, whether on account of veneration, education, or entertainment, would have recognized parallels between the Bacchae and Acts 16 through 40. The most significant parallels between Acts 16 through 40 and Bacchae involve the criminalization of Dionysus, exemplified through three narrative occurrences. Prison breaks, that's the first. The second, confrontation with unjust government officials. And the third, an epiphanic voice. The confrontation in Bacchae squarely juxtaposes Dionysus and his followers against King Pentheus. Paul and his colleagues confront the enslaved girl with the Pythian spirit, her masters, the sheriffs, and the prison guard. In Acts 16:20 through 21, the owners claim that Paul and company are proclaiming a new tradition, and that resonates with Pentheus' concern that a new tradition has been brought to Thebes by the followers of Dionysus. Paul functions as the spokesperson for Jesus, by whose name he exercises the Pythian spirit. In the Bacchae, Dionysus functions as his own spokesperson, although he is disguised. King Pentheus' militarized police bring Dionysus without resistance to the palace to speak on his own behalf. And Dionysus offers petulant responses to Pentheus' inquisition. In Acts 16, the masters drag Paul and the Messiah movement to the forum before the sheriffs, and they do not get the opportunity to respond. Yet Acts Paul does respond petulantly when they seek to release him and the Messiah movement secretly. Acts 16:37-39 reads that Paul says, in front of everybody, they flayed us, Roman humans, in an unlawful manner. They threw us into jail, and now they kick us out secretly? Hell no. Let them come out and lead us out. The armed deputies reported these words to the sheriffs. When they heard that they were Romans, they got scared. They came and confronted them while leading them out. They begged them to leave the city. For Acts, Paul's reaction is a direct response to how he and his movement have been criminalized. Dionysus had also been criminalized by Pentheus. Pentheus falsely charges Dionysus' messenger with disturbing the social order, and he accuses Dionysus of leading women away from their husbands and family life to get them drunk in order to participate in sexual activities. These charges are similar to the ones raised by the masters in Acts 16, who falsely accused the Messiah movement of disturbing the social order, although the accusers' concerns actually center around their loss of a tool for earning income. In the Bacchae, Pentheus lies to his enslaved people that he sends to arrest Dionysus' messengers, who is actually Dionysus in disguise. Pentheus identifies Dionysus as a criminal who needs to receive the death penalty for charges that Pentheus has manufactured. Pentheus still seeks to arrest or place chains on Dionysus, despite evidence that he should not. One piece of evidence that should have convinced Pentheus that he should not punish Dionysus or the Bacchants can be found in how the Bacchants, whom Pentheus had previously arrested, had been miraculously freed from their imprisonment. The enslaved person that arrests Dionysus apologizes to Dionysus for having to participate in this miscarriage of justice. He says in his report to Pentheus, I felt shame and said, stranger, it is not my own free will that I take you away, but on the orders of Pentheus who sent me. This is similar to the response of the deputies who attempt to release Paul and Silas, but Paul sends them back with a message for the sheriffs who had sent them. It's worthwhile here to explain why I use these policing terms that I alluded to in the beginning. Roman historian Christopher Furman makes an intervention in the scholarly conversation around the policing of crime in the Roman Empire. He challenges the widely accepted view that there was no specialized and impartial law enforcement agency in the Roman Republic or Empire. Furman contends that there was indeed policing activity through the Roman Empire in two modes, civilian and military. He recognizes that there was no official state-sponsored institution whose role was to investigate crimes, arrest people, and hold prisoners. However, he does contend that the Roman government used its military apparatus to police Rome, its provinces, and its border regions. Furman's study contributes to our translation of Acts 16:16-40, in which Paul and the Messiah movement are imprisoned in Philippi, where there are two types of policing forces, the strategoi and the rhabdukoi. The term strategoi is equivalent to the Latin position duumviri, a two-man governing team in Italy and the provinces. They primarily dealt with the administration of justice. I translate the term as sheriffs, which in a U.S. context captures how this position was situated between militarized policing and elected officials. This translation also communicates how these officials would have been elected and then would have been tasked with maintaining peace in the city. This translation also captures how these magistrates violently patrolled over their jurisdictions as a pater familias ruled over his house. Note, a papyrus from a 2nd century petitioner states, and I quote, to serve as a strategos, that is to rule and to constrain and to crush and to beat and strike and whip free men like slaves, end quote. The petitioner captures how some under Roman imperial rule encountered local police forces. The sheriffs would have had deputies, or rabdikoi, who carried the fasces. The sheriffs and deputies maintained order through violence, both literally and figuratively, because the fasces became representative of the position. Acts depicts these Roman policing forces as mistreating Paul and the Messiah movement, treating them as low-status criminals because of the stories told about them. Paul and the Messiah movement's criminalization by government officials and militarized police in Acts 16, 24 through 40 would have activated how Dionysus was criminalized by and resistant to government officials for those who knew from the broader cultural popularity the story of Dionysus. An ancient audience aware of Dionysian theology would have known about the god and the god's representative standing up defiantly to speak truth to an authority figure. And they would have been able to connect Dionysus' story to the Messiah movements. They would have been able to deduce that the divinely inspired behavior that resembles Dionysus' activity leads to criminalization. Courtney Friesen writes, the central problem of the Bacchae turns out also to be a perennial problem for Rome. What is to be the relationship between the Bacchic impulse toward liberation and the authority and stability of the Roman political establishment? Acts' dramatic portrait of Paul and the Messiah movement utilizes the same types of motifs as found in both Dionysus' imprisonment and his conflict with government officials who unjustly criminalize him. These motives were pervasive in the Roman world of the earliest audiences of Acts, and Acts appealed to these common themes could lead the audience to identify with the criminalized representatives of the divine and to expose the rampant injustice of tyrannical government actors and co-conspirators. In both the mythology of Dionysus and in Acts 16, the god's speech through an earthquake critiques the official's miscarriage of justice. Acts, like the Bacchae, employs a tragic form, exposing a higher standard of justice, and condemns those officials who discharge their duties unjustly. After the earthquake, in both the Bacchae and in Acts 16, 26 through 28, an epiphanic voice reverberates. In the Bacchae, it is Dionysus' voice speaking to Pentheus, but in Acts 16:28, it is Paul's voice crying out loudly, phone megale, to the prison guard. This moment, along with the exorcism of the Pythian spirit, demonstrate how Paul functions like the disguised messenger of Dionysus in the Bacchae, who is actually Dionysus. Both Dionysus and Paul refuse to be quiet and refuse to be confined. In the case of Acts, it is ultimately the sheriffs who have to give the order to free the people. They send word through the deputies, but Paul asserts that the status quo, being released quietly, is insufficient. Although the entire legal system would not be upended by Paul's demand, the sheriffs were going to have to stop and pause this morning and consider their actions. Even the armed deputies who get caught in between citizens demanding their rights and Roman officials aligned with enslavers' interests have to reimagine their role. They go from delivering commands from Roman authorities to delivering demands to those same authorities. In conclusion, thinking with these ancient stories as myths and with CRT's revisionist history and womanist cultural criticism, we're allowed to examine how judicial systems and stories about gods coalesce for different types of power over humans. This synergy of readings helps us to better reconstruct antiquity, and it also allows us to reflect on society. We see how myths and stories can be used to shore up hegemonic power and to resist empire and its policing representatives. In the passage, before the sheriffs send the words to free the people had already been freed. Because at midnight, when the earth quaked, all the prisons were opened, and not just for those who were a part of the movement. Could this not register as a divine critique of the carceral system? Similarly to when Jesus was lawfully prosecuted and executed, but Acts asserts that God responded by overturning that ruling and raising Jesus from the dead. Along these lines, theologian Willie Jennings notes that the imprisonment of the Messiah movement in Acts 16 must be understood in conversation with Jesus' own arrest, conviction, and sentencing. Jesus was not simply someone, he states, who got caught up in a judicial system, but he's the one who shattered its connection to morality and righteousness because the righteous child of God was in prison. Similarly, Paul and Silas's imprisonment and subsequent release by divine intervention register a theological critique to unjust carceral and judicial practices. Here, God shakes the entire prison and opens all of the gates. Those not a part of the movement are released too. Also similar to Jesus on the cross, liberation theologians have helped us to see that our observation that Jesus should not have been crucified by unjust, brutal Roman practices not only tells us what God thinks about Jesus, but it also tells us what God thinks about those crucified with him. They should be taken off of their crosses, just like all of the imprisoned are released from their prisons. James Cone in The Cross and the Lynching Tree notes that the real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, and humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. Hopefully, this analysis exposes continuity and disruption between the Roman criminalizing of ancient movements and U.S. criminalizing of modern movements like Black Lives Matter, connecting Roman notions of charging people with treason or maiestas against the emperor and the empire for not aligning with Roman mores have contemporary analogs with the criminalization of the descendants of slaves, immigrants, Muslims, and Palestinians. Engaging ancient mythology and paying attention to how stories are told about groups of people provide fertile ground for interrogating how certain groups are still portrayed as criminals. It can also help us to see that the best analogs for the earliest Jesus followers may not be those who wear black robes and white albs, but those who wear orange jumpsuits. Militarized police on beats in Roman Philippi, ready to punish those who were considered other, resonates with tanks rolling down the streets to confront BLM in Washington, D.C. in summer of 2020. These connections should lead us to sobriety, but not hopelessness. They should help us to see our world and use the Bible and Acts to imagine an otherwise world, a world where stories and sheriffs don't create scenarios where someone has to declare, free those people. Because in that world, there are no prisons nor shackles from which people need to be freed. Thank you.